Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the United States ship Nimitz incident of 2004. Imagine, if you will, the vast and heavy silence of the Pacific Ocean. It is early November, a time when the air begins to carry a sharper, saltier chill as it sweeps across the endless dark water. We are roughly 100 miles off the coast of San Diego, where the deep blue of the sea meets a horizon so wide it feels as though the world has no end. Beneath us, the massive hull of the United States ship Princeton, a guided missile cruiser, cuts through the gentle swells with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum. The ship is a world of gray metal and humming electricity, a fortress of technology floating in the cradle of the deep. Inside, the air is cool and recycled, smelling faintly of ozone, floor wax, and the heavy metallic tang of the ocean that clings to everything. Here, time seems to slow down, measured not by the sun, but by the steady, hypnotic pulses of light on a radar screen. Deep within the heart of the ship lies the Combat Information Center. Often called the CIC, it is a room swallowed by a soft, underwater dimness, illuminated only by the glow of various consoles and the tiny, flickering lights of status indicators. The walls are lined with screens that cast a pale sapphire light onto the faces of the men and women on watch. Among them is Senior Chief Kevin Day. He is a man of precision, a master of the airwaves who has spent nearly 20 years staring into the electronic soul of the sky. He sits in a high-backed chair, his eyes adjusted to the shadows, his ears tuned to the quiet symphony of the room. There is the clicking of keyboards, the soft murmur of technical jargon over headsets, and the constant, reassuring whir of cooling fans that keep the advanced computers from overheating. The air is still, almost heavy with the focus of the crew, as they monitor the invisible threads of radar that reach out for hundreds of miles into the atmosphere, searching for anything that should not be there. The Princeton is equipped with the SBY-1 Bravo radar, the most advanced system of its time, a digital eye that can see the smallest bird or the fastest missile. It is a masterpiece of engineering designed to provide a perfect picture of the heavens. But in these early days of November, the picture begins to smudge. Kevin Day notices a group of tracks appearing on his scope. They are small, faint whispers of light, moving in clusters of 5 to 10. At first, they appear near San Clemente Island, drifting slowly southward at an altitude of 28,000 feet. Their speed is a mere 100 knots, far too slow for any jet, yet they are too high and too steady to be a flock of birds. Day watches them with a furrowed brow, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass. There is no transponder signal, no identification friend or foe. They are ghosts in the machine, silent travelers in a restricted airspace that should be empty. He watches them for hours, their movements methodical and calm, as if they are simply grazing on the edges of the horizon. As the days pass, the whispers on the radar grow more defiant. The crew begins to wonder if the system is malfunctioning. They wonder if the brand-new radar is seeing phantoms created by its own internal logic. They go so far as to shut the entire system down, recalibrating every circuit and testing every line of code to ensure that what they are seeing is real. But when the power hums back to life and the screens flicker into clarity, the objects are still there, waiting. And then, the behavior of these guests changes in a way that defies every law of physics the crew has ever known. One of the tracks appears at the very top of the radar's reach, at an incredible height of 80,000 feet, where the air is thin and the edge of space begins. Without warning, the object begins to fall. But it does not fall like a stone or a plane in distress. It descends from 80,000 feet down to just 50 feet above the surface of the ocean in less than 1 second. There is no sonic boom. There is no trail of heat. There is only the impossible transition from the heavens to the waves, happening in the blink of an eye. Kevin Day and his fellow technicians, including Gary Voorhees, stand frozen in the blue light of the CIC. They watch the screen as the object simply stops at 50 feet, hovering perfectly still above the white-capped swells of the Pacific. To move at such a speed, thousands of miles per hour, and then to stop instantly without any visible means of propulsion is a feat that should tear any known craft apart. The forces of gravity involved would turn a human pilot into nothing more than a memory. Yet, the objects seem unbothered. They linger there, just above the water, for several minutes before darting back up to the heights or vanishing entirely from the scope. The atmosphere on the Princeton shifts from professional routine to a quiet, creeping unease. The sailors speak in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the overhead speakers, waiting for an explanation that does not come. These are not glitches. These are not weather balloons or clouds of insects. They are solid, intelligent, and utterly incomprehensible. For nearly a week, these whispers persist on the radar, a haunting presence that refuses to be ignored. They seem to be watching the strike group, hovering at the edges of the training exercises like silent observers at a grand theater. Kevin Day feels a weight settling in his chest, a realization that the world he thought he understood has been breached by something else. The tension in the CIC is thick, like the air before a summer storm, as the crew realizes that their superior technology is being outmatched by an unknown visitor. Finally, after days of monitoring these impossible descents and eerie hovering patterns, the decision is made to send a set of eyes into the sky to see what the radar cannot fully describe. The order is given to scramble the jets. As the sun begins to climb over the California coast on the 14th of November, the deck of the Nimitz erupts into life. But down in the dark, quiet rooms of the Princeton, the radar operators simply wait, watching the blips that have become their constant, silent companions. The whispers are about to become a scream. The morning of November 14th, 2004, began with a clarity that felt almost artificial. High above the Pacific, the sky was a seamless vault of pale, crystalline blue, stretching toward a horizon so sharp it looked like the edge of a blade. Below, the ocean was a vast sheet of deep sapphire, remarkably still and devoid of the usual white-crested waves. It was the kind of perfect, tranquil weather that pilots dream of, yet there was a stillness in the air that felt expectant, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. Commander David Fravor, a seasoned veteran and the commanding officer of the Black Aces, sat within the cramped, high-tech sanctuary of his FA-18F Super Hornet. The cockpit was a cocoon of humming electronics and the low, rhythmic thrum of twin engines, a familiar symphony that masked the immense power at his fingertips. Beside him in the sky was his wingman, Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, her own yet a sleek shadow against the sun. Together, they were part of a routine training mission, a 2-on-2 air-to-air exercise designed to sharpen the instincts of the elite aviators stationed aboard the aircraft carrier Nimitz. The smell of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic tang of jet fuel filled their masks, a sensory constant in a world defined by altitude and speed. As they banked into their planned maneuvers, the professional rhythm of the morning was abruptly severed. A voice crackled through their headsets, cutting through the static with an edge of real-world urgency. It was the air controller from the USS Princeton, a guided missile cruiser positioned miles away, whose advanced radar systems had been haunted by ghosts for nearly a week. The controller's instructions were clear and unusual. The training mission was suspended. They were being vectored toward a real-world contact, a mysterious target that had been appearing and disappearing on radar screens, performing feats of physics that defied every known law of aviation. Fravor felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the subtle tightening of his G-suit against his legs as he adjusted his heading. This was no longer a game of shadows and simulated combat. They were being sent into the unknown, guided by a voice on the radio, toward a set of coordinates where something impossible was waiting. The transition from the structured safety of a drill to the unpredictable reality of an intercept felt like stepping from a brightly lit room into a dark, echoing hall. They accelerated, the Pacific rushing beneath them in a blur of indigo, their eyes scanning the empty void for any sign of a trespasser. As they approached the target coordinates, approximately 100 miles southwest of San Diego, the voice from the Princeton returned, informing them that they were now merging with the plot. This meant that, according to the radar, they were occupies the same physical space as the unidentified contact. Yet, as Fravor and Dietrich looked through the thick glass of their canopies, the sky appeared hauntingly empty. There were no exhaust plumes, no glinting wings, and no silhouettes of distant aircraft. The world was just blue on blue, a terrifyingly beautiful vacuum. But then, Fravor looked down. In a sea that was otherwise as flat as a mirror, he spotted a localized area of chaos. Directly beneath them, in the middle of the empty ocean, the water was churning and roiling. It wasn't the natural swell of a wave or the wake of a ship. Instead, it looked as if something massive were submerged just beneath the surface, a disturbance that Fravor later described as being roughly the size of a Boeing 737. The white water stood out against the deep blue like a wound, a frothing, circular turbulence that suggested something immense was struggling or hovering just out of sight in the depths. The sight was hypnotic and deeply wrong, a breach in the tranquility of the morning that demanded an explanation. It was then that they saw it. Hovering just above the churning white water was an object that looked like it had been plucked from a different reality. It was a smooth, solid white craft, approximately 40 feet long, shaped precisely like an elongated egg or a giant Tic Tac breath mint. There were no wings, no tail fins, and no visible means of propulsion. There were no windows, no doors, and no seams on its matte, featureless surface. It seemed to ignore the wind and the salt spray, moving with a jarring, erratic motion that Fravor would later compare to a ping-pong ball bouncing inside a glass jar. It flitted from side to side, north to south, then east to west, with instantaneous changes in direction that would have liquefied a human pilot inside any conventional jet. It didn't bank or turn. It simply shifted its position in space, as if it were being moved by an invisible hand. The four aviators, 2 in each jet, watched in a stunned, heavy silence. The high-definition world of their sensors was useless against a target that had no heat signature and no radar return. They were relying on the most ancient of tools, the human eye. The Tic Tac continued its frantic, nonsensical dance over the frothing waves, a ghost made manifest in the bright California sun. The contrast between the Navy's most advanced fighter jets and this silent, white anomaly was profound. Fravor's Super Hornet was a masterpiece of 20th-century engineering, a machine of fire, metal, and violent thrust. Yet, as he circled high above, he felt like a primitive observer watching a miracle. The object below him didn't seem to be flying in the way a bird or a plane flies. It seemed to be manipulating the very space around it. There was no rotor wash disturbing the ocean, no scent of burning fuel, and no sound of an engine reaching their ears across the distance. It was a silent intruder, an elegant and terrifying enigma that seemed completely indifferent to the presence of the 2 multi-million-dollar warplanes circling it. Dietrich, remaining at a higher altitude to provide cover, felt a cold sense of vulnerability. They were armed only with the training of their minds and the sensors of their aircraft, neither of which seemed capable of grasping what they were seeing. The white water below continued to boil, a secret conversation between the object and the ocean, while the sun beat down on the featureless white hull of the craft. It was a moment where the modern world cracked open, revealing a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, yet was there, tangible and defiant, in the center of their field of vision. Fravor decided to close the distance. He began a slow, spiraling descent, a predatory move intended to get a better look at the visitor. He guided his jet down, the air screaming past his wings as he banked into a tight circle. As he moved, something even more unsettling occurred. The tic-tac, which had been darting aimlessly over the water, suddenly stopped. It seemed to acknowledge his presence, tilting its longitudinal axis to point directly at him. Then, as Fravor descended, the object began to climb. It mirrored his circular path, rising up to meet him as if they were two dancers on a spiral staircase. The proximity allowed Fravor to see just how truly featureless it was, a perfect, porcelain-white cylinder against the backdrop of the deep, dark sea. There was no shimmer of a cockpit, no rivets, no markings of any nation or company. It was a void of information, a physical contradiction. As they drew closer to one another, the sense of unreality deepened. The pilot's heart hammered against his ribs, his gloved hands steady on the controls, yet his mind was racing to find a category, a label, a name for the thing that was now rising toward him with impossible grace. The chase had begun, but the rules of engagement were written in a language that no one in the United States military could yet understand. The spiral was a patient, tightening coil. Commander Fravor felt the steady, familiar pressure of gravity pulling at his chest, a weight that increased as he banked his multi-million-dollar machine into a downward curve. Through the thick glass of the canopy, the Pacific Ocean was a vast, glittering sheet of deep sapphire, broken only by that strange, frothy patch of white water directly below. The sun sat high and indifferent, casting long, sharp glints off the surface of the sea, making the water look like shattered diamonds. Inside the cockpit, the air was cool and smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic tang of electronic components. Every breath Fravor took was a rhythmic, mechanical sound inside his mask, a reminder of the thin line between his life and the void outside. He watched the white object, that smooth, oblong shape, as it hovered just above the churning waves. It did not bob or sway with the wind. It was simply there, a defiant piece of white marble suspended in a world of moving blue. As Fravor continued his descent, spiraling down from 20,000 feet, he noticed a shift. The object was no longer just wandering over the white water. It had stopped its erratic, ping-pong-like movements and had begun to rotate. Its long axis slowly tilted, pointing itself directly toward his aircraft as if acknowledging his approach. The predatory dance had begun. The sensation was jarring. In all his years of flying, Fravor had never seen something respond with such eerie precision. As he descended, the white object began to rise. It did not bank like a plane, and it did not use rotors like a helicopter. It simply drifted upward, mirroring his circular path from the opposite side of an invisible circle. It was a two-circle fight, a classic aerial maneuver, but his opponent was not an aircraft he recognized. It was roughly 40 feet long, the size of his own fighter, yet it possessed no wings, no tail, and no visible means of propulsion. There were no exhaust plumes scorching the air, and no control surfaces shifting to catch the wind. It was a smooth, candy-coated pill, brilliant white against the darkening blue of the lower altitudes. Fravor's eyes were locked on it, straining to see a seam, a rivet, or a window, but there was nothing. The object was a perfect, featureless void of detail. His hands, encased in Nomex flight gloves, moved with practiced grace over the controls, but the craft below seemed to move by thought alone. It was ascending at the same rate he was descending, maintaining a perfect, haunting symmetry. The distance between them was closing, and the silence in the radio chatter was heavy, filled only with the faint hiss of static and the pounding of his own heart. Fravor decided he had seen enough from a distance. He wanted to close the gap, to force a reaction from this visitor that defied the laws of physics. At approximately 12,000 feet, he pulled the nose of his Super Hornet toward the object, intending to cross the circle and meet it head-on. The physical transition was intense. He could feel the blood pulling away from his head as the G-force increased, the suit around his legs inflating to keep him conscious. He was less than half a mile away now, a distance so short in the world of aviation that he should have been able to see the very texture of the craft's hull. He expected the object to maneuver, to dive, or perhaps to show some sign of aerodynamic struggle as it fought the thin air. But it did none of those things. It waited until he was almost upon it, a moment of frozen time where the world seemed to hold its breath. And then it happened. In a fraction of a second, faster than a human eye can blink, the object vanished. It did not fly away. It did not accelerate through the sound barrier with a thunderous boom. It simply ceased to be in that space. It was a frame rate skip in reality. One moment the white pill was filling his field of vision, and the next there was only the empty, shimmering air and the vast, lonely ocean below. The suddenness of the disappearance left a vacuum of confusion in the cockpit. Fravor looked down at the spot where the white water had been only moments before. The disturbance in the sea, the churning foam that looked like a sunken ship, was gone. The surface of the Pacific was now calm and unbroken, a flat mirror of blue that stretched to the horizon. There was no wake, no splash, and no sign that anything had ever been there. He looked at his wingman, Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, who was circling thousands of feet above. Her voice came through the headset, breathless and questioning. They were 4 highly trained observers, and none of them could explain where the craft had gone. It was as if the object had stepped out of the physical world and into another dimension. Fravor turned his jet, scanning the skies for any sign of a trail or a glint of white, but the radar remained hauntingly clean. The sophisticated sensors of the Super Hornet, designed to track the most advanced threats on the planet, saw nothing but empty air. The silence that followed was thick, a heavy blanket of disbelief that seemed to settle over the entire flight group as they leveled their wings and began to breathe again. A few seconds later, the silence was shattered by a crackle in the radio. It was the voice of the controller from the USS Princeton, the cruiser that had been tracking these anomalies for days. The controller's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable note of shock in his tone. He told Fravor that the object had reappeared. It wasn't just nearby, it had been detected 60 miles away. In the span of less than 1 minute, the Tic Tac had covered a distance that would take a conventional, yet several minutes of high-speed flight to traverse. But the location was what truly sent a chill down Fravor's spine. The object was sitting exactly at his CAP point, the Combat Air Patrol point. This was a secret, predetermined coordinate in the sky where Fravor and his wingman were scheduled to meet and loiter after their training mission was complete. It was a point in space known only to the pilots and the radar operators on the ship. The object had not just fled, it had anticipated their next move. It had gone to their destination before they even knew they were heading there. It was a display of technological dominance that made their state-of-the-art fighters feel like children's toys, slow and primitive in the face of a ghost that knew their secrets. As Fravor turned his aircraft toward the 60-mile journey to the meeting point, a profound sense of isolation began to settle over him. The cockpit, once a place of absolute control and power, now felt small and fragile. He looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a haze of soft light. The physics of the world he knew, the world of thrust and lift, of inertia and gravity, had been discarded by an intruder that did not play by the rules. To travel 60 miles in such a short time would require speeds exceeding several thousand miles per hour. Yet the radar operators had reported no sonic boom, and the object had shown no heat signature. It moved through the atmosphere as if the air itself did not exist, a phantom slicing through the world without leaving a fingerprint. He thought of the object waiting for him at the coordinate, hovering in the empty sky, silent and white. There was no fear yet, only a deep, vibrating curiosity that hummed in the back of his mind. Who, or what, could possibly possess a technology that could leap across the sky in the blink of an eye? The ocean below remained vast and keeping its secrets, while above, the 2004 sun began its slow, golden descent toward the edge of the world. The afternoon sun hung heavy and low over the Pacific, casting long, shimmering ribbons of gold across the deep turquoise swells. Aboard the USS Nimitz, the air was thick with the pungent, oily scent of jet fuel and the rhythmic, metallic thrum of a floating fortress in motion. Lieutenant Chad Underwood climbed into the cockpit of his FA-18 Super Hornet, the seat harness clicking with a familiar, heavy finality. He had just crossed paths with Commander David Fravor on the flight deck, a brief and hurried exchange between two pilots that left an unspoken weight hanging in the air. Fravor's eyes had held a look of quiet, unsettled intensity, a reflection of the impossible thing he had just seen dancing above the waves. As Underwood settled into the narrow, functional confines of his seat, the canopy slid shut with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing him away from the chaotic roar of the deck crews. The world outside became a silent pantomime of yellow-shirted sailors, and the white steam rising from the catapult tracks like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. With a sudden, visceral jolt, the catapult fired, hurling the massive aircraft into the bright blue expanse. The crushing weight of gravity pressed him back into the cushions, a heavy hand against his chest, as the blue water vanished beneath his wings, replaced by the shimmering, endless horizon of the open sea. The climb to altitude was a lonely journey through a sky that felt too vast and too empty. The steady hum of the twin engines vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of his boots, a comforting, mechanical heartbeat in the silence. Underwood adjusted his oxygen mask, the rubber cool against his skin, and focused on the glowing arrays of his instrument panels. The light from the screens bathed the cockpit in a soft, emerald luminescence, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. He was being guided by the USS Princeton, the Aegis cruiser whose radar operators had been tracking mysterious intruders for days. Through his headset, the voice of the radar controller was calm but clipped, providing the coordinates for a point in the sky where the anomalies had been seen. As he leveled out at 20,000 feet, the ocean below turned into a dark, wrinkled fabric of navy and slate. Then it happened. A tiny, sharp blip appeared on his radar screen, a solitary mark against the green grid. It was not a ghost or a glitch. It was something solid, something real, waiting for him in the vastness of the 2 o'clock sun. Underwood reached for the controls of his AT-FLIR pod, the advanced targeting infrared sensor mounted beneath his left wing. With a gentle nudge of his thumb, he slaved the camera to the radar hit, asking the machine to find what the radio waves had detected. On his multifunction display, the screen flickered, and then a grainy, black-and-white world came into focus. There, suspended against the cold backdrop of the sky, was the object. It looked like a smooth, elongated pill, a tiny white capsule hovering in a void. It was the shape that would lead him to coin the name that would haunt the world for decades, the Tic Tac. He toggled the sensor between white-hot and black-hot modes, trying to find a signature of life or technology. Usually, a jet engine would bloom on the screen like a bright, white flower of heat, trailing a long, dark plume of exhaust across the atmosphere. But this object was different. It was cold. There was no heat, no wings, and no visible means of staying aloft. It simply sat there, a 40-foot-long mystery defying the very air that supported Underwood's own heavy machine. As he closed the distance to 20 miles, the pilot attempted to lock his sensors onto the craft, a standard procedure for identifying an unknown contact. But the Tic Tac reacted with a sophisticated defiance. The radar screen began to strobe and flicker, filled with lines of electronic interference that suggested the object was actively jamming his systems. In the world of naval aviation, jamming is considered an act of war, a hostile gesture from a hidden hand. Yet there was no aggression from the craft, only an eerie, silent presence. On his infrared screen, the object began to move with a jerky, erratic rhythm, jumping from one side of the crosshairs to the other in a way that no human pilot could replicate. It moved with the twitchy, unpredictable grace of a dragonfly, stopping and starting without the slightest hint of momentum or inertia. Underwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the cockpit. He was watching something that didn't belong to the physics he had studied, something that seemed to exist outside the rules of the world he knew. The recording continued, the camera struggling to keep the oblong shape centered in its gaze. The object hovered between 15,000 and 24,000 feet, sometimes dropping toward the ocean's surface with a speed that made the eyes ache. Underwood watched as the Tic Tac suddenly began to accelerate toward the left. It didn't bank or turn like a plane. It simply translated across the sky, gaining a velocity that was breathtaking. Within a heartbeat, the object moved so fast that it broke the sensor's lock, disappearing from the edge of the screen like a spark leaping from a fire. The infrared display was left with only the empty, gray grain of the sky. Underwood sat in the sudden quiet of his cockpit, his heart hammering against his ribs, the only sound the steady, rhythmic intake of his own breath through the regulator. He had the footage. He had the proof. But as he turned his jet back toward the USS Nimitz, the vast blue ocean beneath him felt deeper and more mysterious than it ever had before. The afternoon light was fading, and in the growing shadows, he knew he was carrying back a secret that would change the way we look at the stars forever. The ocean below the United States ship Princeton was a deep, restless indigo, a surface that looked like crumpled velvet under the hazy sun of November 14, 2004. Inside the hull of the cruiser, the world felt vastly different. It was a place of humming machinery, the smell of recycled air, and the constant, low-frequency vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines that powered the massive vessel through the Pacific. In the Cooperative Engagement Center, the air was cool and dry, a necessary environment for the racks of electronics that served as the ship's brain. For days, the crew had been tracking anomalies that defied every law of physics they understood. But now, as the intercept ended and the pilots returned to the carrier, a different kind of tension began to settle into the metal bones of the ship. It was the silence of a question that no one was permitted to ask aloud. The radar screens, once filled with the impossible movements of the white, oblong craft, were now hauntingly clear. Yet the data they had captured remained etched into the magnetic tapes and optical drives, a digital ghost waiting to be reckoned with. Gary Voorhees, a petty officer 3rd class, felt the weight of that silence more than most. He was responsible for the ship's advanced radar and combat systems, and his hands were intimately familiar with the equipment that had just witnessed the impossible. As he stood among the blinking lights and the rhythmic, electronic chirping of the consoles, the sound of an approaching helicopter began to bleed through the bulkheads. It wasn't the usual rhythmic thrum of a scheduled transport. It felt sudden, urgent. On the flight deck, the wind whipped the salt spray into a fine mist as a helicopter settled onto the steel plating. From its belly stepped 2 individuals who did not fit the established rhythm of the strike group. They wore flight suits, but they lacked the familiar patches, the colorful insignias, or the names that usually signaled a sailor's identity and history. They were ciphers, moving with a calculated, brisk purpose that suggested they were operating on a timeline far removed from the daily chores of a carrier strike group training mission. Their arrival was not announced over the general announcing system. It simply happened, like a shadow falling across a room. Within 20 minutes of their boots hitting the deck, the order filtered down through the chain of command to Voorhees. It was a command that felt alien in its directness. He was told to surrender all data recordings for the Aegis system. Gary felt the cool, metallic surface of the recording canisters as he began the process of retrieval. Usually, such data was treated with a meticulous paper trail, a sequence of signatures and logs that ensured every byte of information was accounted for. But here, the protocol was being bypassed by a sense of extreme gravity. He was instructed not just to hand over the recorded tapes, but to erase everything in his shop. This included the optical drives that held the radio communications and even the blank tapes that had never seen a single bit of data. The air in the room felt thick, the scent of ozone from the equipment mixing with the sharp, cold realization that a memory was being scrubbed from existence. As he watched the indicators show the drives being wiped clean, Gary realized that the history of the last several days was being physically removed, leaving nothing but the fallible recollections of the men who had been there. Across the water, on the deck of the United States ship Nimitz, a similar scene was unfolding in the shadows of the massive aircraft carrier's hangar bay. Petty Officer Patrick Hughes, an aviation technician, was performing his routine duties as the E-2 Hawkeye landed. The Hawkeye was the eyes of the fleet, a twin-turboprop aircraft with a massive rotating radar dome that captured everything within hundreds of miles. As the engines began their long, whining cool-down, Hughes climbed into the cramped, electronics-filled cabin to retrieve the data bricks. These were heavy, rectangular hard drives, finished in a dull, brushed aluminum that felt cold and solid in his hands. These bricks contained every mouse click, every radar return, and every word spoken by the aircrew during the encounter with the Tic Tac. He carried them to the secure workspace, placing them into the squadron's safe, expecting them to be reviewed by his own officers in the coming days. But the cycle of normal operations had already been broken by an unseen hand. Less than 15 minutes after the drives were secured, Hughes's commanding officer appeared at the door of the work center. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him were two men in flight suits that Hughes didn't recognize. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't offer a greeting or a nod of professional courtesy. They simply stood there, their presence a silent pressure in the small room. The commanding officer, a man Hughes respected and knew well, spoke with a tone that was strangely flat, devoid of its usual warmth. He requested the bricks from the last flight immediately. There was no paperwork to sign, no hand receipts to fill out, and no explanation given for why these strangers were taking custody of some of the Navy's most sensitive surveillance data. Hughes reached into the safe, the weight of the two drives pulling at his arms. He placed them into the bags held by the visitors. As the men turned to leave, the heavy hatch of the work center swung shut with a dull, echoing thud, leaving Hughes in a room that suddenly felt much emptier than it had moments before. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the Pacific in bruised purples and golds, but the mood across the strike group remained dark and guarded. Word began to spread through the mess decks and the berthing areas in hushed whispers, a low murmur of shared confusion. Sailors looked at one another with a new kind of wariness, realizing that they were part of something that was being actively managed and partitioned. On the Princeton, the logs were being altered, and the technical records of the radar anomalies were vanishing into the Admiral's quarters, guarded by men who didn't exist on any manifest. The crew members were left to wonder why. If the objects were merely malfunctions or atmospheric ghosts, such high-level, clandestine intervention was necessary. The physical evidence was gone, carried away in nameless helicopters to destinations unknown, leaving only the sensory memories of the salt air, the frantic calls over the radio, and the sight of a white, candy-coated object dancing over the waves. The unseen arrival had transformed a tactical encounter into a lingering mystery, one that was now buried beneath layers of classified silence and the deep, cold waters of the Pacific. For 13 years, the secret of the Pacific remained a whisper, a ghost story told in the quiet corners of officers' clubs and during the long, star-drenched watches of the night. The year was 2004 when the white, oblong craft first danced before the eyes of Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich. Yet the world at large remained oblivious. The sky over the Pacific had closed its curtains, and the men and women who witnessed the impossible returned to their lives, their families, and their duties, carrying a weight they could not easily share. The radar data, the infrared footage, and the stunned exclamations of the weapons systems officers were tucked away into the dark, cold archives of military memory. Time moved forward, as it always does, like a slow tide pulling away from the shore, leaving the events of that November afternoon to settle into the silt of history. But truth has a way of breathing under the surface, waiting for the moment when the pressure becomes too great and the veil must finally be lifted. The transition happened on a crisp, biting Saturday in December of 2017. In the bustling heart of Manhattan, within the glass and steel cathedral of the New York Times, a story was being polished that would change the narrative of our skies forever. Reporters Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean had been pulling on a thread that led deep into the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon. Their investigation revealed the existence of a shadowy, $22 million program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or a ATIP. It was a revelation that smelled of old parchment and digital ink, a hidden corner of the government dedicated to studying the unexplainable. As the article titled "Glowing Auras and Black Money" went live, the digital hum of the internet amplified a secret that had been held in silence for over a decade. The world woke up to the realization that the military had not only been watching these objects, but was deeply unsettled by them. The calm, gray facade of official denial had finally begun to crack, revealing the strange light that lay beneath. Central to this awakening was a man named Luis Elizondo, a career intelligence officer who had led the program until his resignation in October of 2017. His departure was a quiet act of protest, a soft footfall in the halls of power that echoed with the force of a thunderclap. He spoke of craft that possessed no visible wings, no engines, and no exhaust, moving with a fluid grace that defied every law of physics we hold dear. He described the 5 observables that these objects displayed: sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without a sonic boom, low observability, transmedium travel from the vacuum of space to the depths of the ocean, and anti-gravity lift. Imagine a craft that can drop from 80,000 feet to the surface of the water in less than a second, stopping on a dime without a ripple of air or a flash of heat. It is a technology that makes our most advanced fighter jets look like paper planes in a hurricane. The more the public learned, the more the silence of the previous 13 years felt like a heavy, stifling blanket that was finally being pulled back to reveal the cold, starlit reality of our vulnerability. The footage itself, captured by Lieutenant Commander Chad Underwood in 2004 and known as the FLIR-1 video, became a focal point of this new era of transparency. It is a grainy, monochromatic window into a moment of pure confusion. You can see the white, tic-tac-shaped object hovering in the center of the crosshairs, steady and unmoving, until it suddenly lurches to the left with a speed that the tracking system cannot follow. There is no fire, no smoke, no sign of propulsion. It simply moves. In April of 2020, the Pentagon took the unprecedented step of officially releasing 3 videos, including the Nimitz footage and 2 others from 2015 known as Gimbal and Go Fast. The official statement was dry and calculated, intended to clear up any misconceptions about the authenticity of the leaked files, but the effect was profound. The United States government was formally acknowledging that their pilots were encountering objects they could not identify and could not replicate. The mystery was no longer a conspiracy theory whispered in the shadows. It was an official record, stamped and filed in the annals of national security. As we look back at the events of the 2004 Nimitz encounter, we are left with more questions than we had when we started. What were those pilots truly seeing as they circled over the white water churning in the blue Pacific? Was it a secret technology from a terrestrial adversary, or something far more ancient and distant? The pilots themselves, now retired and speaking openly, describe a sense of awe that has never left them. David Fravor often recounts how the object seemed to know his intentions, mirroring his movements like a predator or a playful ghost. The ocean beneath them, vast and deep, hides its own secrets, and some wonder if these craft are not visitors from the stars, but residents of the abyss. The air in our rooms tonight feels still, but out there, beyond the reach of our streetlights and our satellites, the sky remains an open frontier of the unknown. We are left to wonder about the silence that still remains and the truths that are yet to be whispered in the coming years. The Pacific waves continue to roll, rhythmic and eternal, washing over the places where the tic-tac once danced. The memories of the pilots and the data in the vaults are all parts of a puzzle that may never be fully solved. But for tonight, the search is over. The questions can wait for the morning light. Let the vastness of the sky and the depth of the ocean bring you a sense of peace rather than fear, for we are all just travelers in this great, mysterious universe. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.